Good evening and welcome to Adath Congregation's Zoom presentation featuring Ambassador Ido Aharoni. I'm Joel Schachter, a member of Adath Israel Congregation. Thanks to the Adult Education Committee under the chairmanship of Joe Traeger and Phil David, Executive Chairman of Adath, and his staff for putting on tonight's program. Also, a thank you to the Canadian Friends of Tel Aviv University, our speaker's alma mater and a promotional partner for tonight's presentation. Another housekeeping item, if you have any questions for the speaker, you can submit them through the chat button on your screen at any time during the presentation. We are very pleased to have as tonight's moderator, Steve Shulman, a highly respected community leader. And I'd like to say a few words about Steve. Stephen Shulman serves as the Senior Vice President, Corporate Affairs, Community Relations, and Counsel for the UJA Federation of Greater Toronto. Prior to serving in his current role, Stephen was Campaign Director and Counsel for United Jewish Appeal of Greater Toronto for 10 years and was the author of the fundraising aspect of UJA's current strategic plan. Stephen also served in senior roles with Canadian Jewish Congress, and among the files he worked on was countering anti-Semitic, anti-Israeli resolutions of the Canadian labor unions. Stephen was in private legal practice for 11 years. He's a graduate of Osgoode Hall Law School, a member of the Law Society of Ontario, and admitted to the New York Bar. Stephen, please welcome Stephen Shulman.
Thank you, Joel, and thanks to all of you who have joined us this evening. Tonight's topic, Israel's political system in the age of coronavirus, could not be more relevant at this time. It couldn't be more relevant for the people of Israel, and it couldn't be more relevant for those of us here in the diaspora, and particularly Toronto and the Adath Israel community, who care so deeply about what happens in our one and only Jewish state. And in tonight's speaker, Ido Aharoni, we have someone who helped create Brand Israel based on fact, based on, among those facts, a scientifically and technologically cutting-edge society with deep shared values of democracy, as we have here in Canada, for instance. And since the pandemic hit, it's been a roller coaster worldwide, but it's been a particularly violent ride in Israel. When we look at it, you'll recall that, of course, at the start of the pandemic, many of us here in Canada were saying, why can't we replicate what they're doing in Israel with such low case counts, a lockdown? And then Israel opened up and people here said, well, why can't we do that as well? But eventually, of course, the case count started to go up and to be one of the highest case counts in the world. And at the same time, the government was grappling with what to do, and the political system was grappling with what to do with coronavirus. It was also dealing with a number of factors, one of them being corruption charges against the Prime Minister, Netanyahu, another being, of course, balancing the economic concerns, as all societies do, a number of peace deals that have come to fruition, and still others I would think being negotiated right now. And of course, balancing rights of people in terms of the right to demonstrate politically against the government and prime minister, and religious rights of those in Israel to come together, to learn, to daven, and other religious rights. And of course, all of that against ensuring the health of all the people, all segments of Israeli society. Hence our topic tonight. And who better than our featured speaker to address this topic? Ambassador Ido Aharoni serves as Global Distinguished Professor for International Relations at New York University's Graduate School of Arts and Science. He's a member of the International Advisory Council of APCO Worldwide, a founder of Emerson Rigby, which is an Israel-based full-service consultancy, chairman of the Charney Forum for New Diplomacy, and global ambassador for Maccabi World Union. You have to wonder how the ambassador has such time. Ambassador Aharoni has served Israel and the Jewish people with great distinction over many years. Among his accomplishments, he's a 25-year veteran of Israel's foreign service, a public diplomacy specialist, as I mentioned moments ago, founder of the Brand Israel program, and a well-known nation branding practitioner. And I have to believe that's not a long list when it comes to nation branding practitioners. Ambassador Aharoni is Israel's longest-serving consul general in New York to this day. He held that position for 6 years, overseeing the operations of Israel's largest diplomatic mission anywhere, and that includes embassies around the world, including Washington and London. It's our distinct honor to hear from you, Ambassador Aharoni.
I just wanted to thank you for your wonderful introduction, and I'm thank God I have a dark skin complexion. You can't see that I'm blushing, but thank you so much, Steve. It's good to see you again. I haven't seen you in a long time. You look good. And just wanted all of you to know that you have greetings from Jerusalem. I'm right now in Jerusalem. It's past 1 a.m. Israel time, and I'm very happy to spend some time with you to share with you what's happening here in Israel. And indeed, Steve, you touched upon some of the most important issues of the last 10 months since this pandemic stormed into our lives. And in many ways, if I may share my screen, if I can ask the host to allow me to share some of the slides I'd like to show you. All right, let's see if I can share.
You can share screen, just use the green button at the bottom of your screen.
Here it is. Here it is. So, in many ways, COVID-19 is the perfect storm all over the world. In what way? It exposed the systemic deficiencies and weaknesses of governments. And I think Israel is not unique in that sense. It exposed the global leadership crisis, the systemic under-preparedness to such a pandemic, governmental ineptitude in many cases, a lack of transparency, but perhaps the most important thing that it exposed is how vulnerable we all are to the devastating impact of information overload. Our brain was not designed to handle so many stimulations simultaneously. And with the information revolution, the human brain is exposed to an unprecedented number of stimulations. And what it does, it heightens the level of anxiety. It distorts the ability to make decisions. And above all, it pushes us all to look for very simple solutions to highly complex issues. And COVID-19 is a highly complex threat. It's not a simple threat. There's a link connecting phenomenons like Brexit with the reaction to COVID-19. What is Brexit if not a simple solution to a highly complex problem? And the same thing is happened in COVID-19. And let me explain what happened in Israel. But before that, a little bit about the future. What do we know about the future, and how is it related to COVID-19? We don't know much, but we do know this. Life expectancy is going to go up, right? When von Bismarck determined that 70 should be the retirement age, it was because he himself was 74 at the time in Germany. But life expectancy early 20th century was around 60 to 65. My unborn grandchildren will be born into a world where life expectancy will be around 90 or 95. The social safety networks in nations from Canada through the United States all the way to Israel did not plan for that dramatic increase in life expectancy. And so the pension structure doesn't reflect that. The social security structure doesn't reflect that. It's the first thing that we know about the future. The second thing that we know about the future is that most of the jobs as we know them today will be modified, if not eliminated, by technology and the introduction of artificial intelligence. And then lastly, we know that the vast majority of people, and if we have 7.5 billion people today, we are projected to have at least 10 billion people by 2050. 75% of them will live in major urban centers. The combination of all three says something very, very simple. We will have to redesign the new contract that emerged in late 19th century, early 20th century, that basically reflected a simple bargain or a simple commitment. We, the citizens, were supposed to be productive and to abide by the law and pay our taxes. The government is supposed to provide us with the basics, with health, with education, with physical safety. That very basic social contract was rattled by COVID-19 because governments had to spend money they don't have. Governments will still have to print money they don't have. And the implications will be felt for generations to come, not years to come, generations to come, in my estimations. What happened in Israel is very, very unique. The first thing that you should know about the Israeli system is that in Israel, we can make a very strong case for what we call the non-centrality of government. It's true that COVID-19 for a while brought back the governments to center stage. Governments as regulators in the healthcare space are very, very important. But the truth is that in Israel, it's bottom up rather than top down. Those of you who had connections in Israel know how the first lockdown ended. First lockdown ended by the Israelis, not by the government. It was the last day of Passover, of Pesach. People just stormed the streets, and the Israeli public decided that the lockdown ended, not the Israeli government. The Israeli government had to follow through. So it's the first thing to know about the Israeli system. It's bottom up, not necessarily top down. It's the Israeli public that dictates the rollout and not the other way around. Travel was the main agent of the pandemic. Israel is a country that is, in fact, you could say it's landlocked, although we have access to the ocean, but because there is no free travel in our region, meaning you can't get into your car in Istanbul and just drive to Haifa, just cannot happen. So air travel was the number one agent of the pandemic. And we know for a fact that the pandemic arrived in Israel from the United States. We also discovered in Israel that isolation as a long-term solution is not sustainable. And you mentioned correctly in your introductory remarks what happened in Israel during the lockdown. It's very simple to announce a lockdown, a national lockdown. It's the easiest solution. One of the reasons politicians resort to that solution is because they know that people don't trust them. So they have a tendency to take the harshest measures possible. I just read that in France, Macron announced a second lockdown. A lockdown is not a sustainable solution. There must be a different approach that is looking at the situation in a very differentiated way, in a multi-layered fashion, because a lockdown is just buying time. It doesn't really change much. But perhaps the most important thing that can be said about the way COVID-19 rattled the Israeli system is that it's perhaps the most politicized crisis, at least in my lifetime. I'll give you just one example. The number of infections reported daily was a direct byproduct of the number of tests conducted daily. So if in the beginning of the pandemic, the average number of daily testing was around 400 to 500 tests a day, which obviously resulted in very low number of reported infections. Then 5 months later, we went up to 75,000 tests a day, and those were not random tests. Those were tests that were performed in what we call red zones, mostly ultra-Orthodox concentrations or major Arab villages. So naturally, it increased the numbers of reported infections. And what it did, it created mass public hysteria. But the truth of the matter is that the number of people in grave condition hasn't really changed. The number of fatalities, when you compare the number of people dying in Israel in general since March of 2020 until today, the last seven, when you look at the number of people dying in Israel, as opposed to the same months in 2019, 2018, the numbers are actually lower. It's about 10% less people dying in Israel today than they died last year or 2 years ago. And the explanation is that the social distancing, um, the um, uh, the two lockdowns that we had, which weren't much of a lockdown, the second lockdown was very loosely enforced. Um, the fact that people maintain uh, all the precautionary measures, and more importantly, the fact that less and less people actually turn to hospitals for medical treatment, brought down the number of deaths, the general number of deaths. It's an astonishing piece of information that most people do not discuss. Now, obviously, the pandemic has other um, um, grave repercussions in the area of course, of mental health, of loneliness, of the ability to overcome economic distress. Um, we have an unprecedented level of unemployment, and so on. Um, Israeli society, on a scale of religiosity, um, that scale became a major predictor in the way you respond to the pandemic. So we have five different groups in Israel when it comes to religiosity, or the level of religiosity, and I'm putting the Arab Israelis in a different category because the vast majority of them are Muslims. Almost 2 million Arabs in Israel. There's a small Christian community among them of about 150,000 people. But when you're looking at the Jewish population on a scale of religiosity, you have the ultra Orthodox on the one end, and the secular Israelis, we'll call them the non-practicing Israelis. In between, you have two very, very strong and powerful groups. One is the national religious, and the other are the traditionals. The traditionals are people that are not necessarily practicing Judaism, but their form of Judaism is Orthodox. Like my father was like that. My father was a non-observant, non-practicing Orthodox Jew. He was a traditionalist, had a lot of respect to Jewish tradition, and was a believer. Now, there is a strong argument to be made that um, the level of religiosity is linked to either the chances that you will be infected by COVID-19 or your response. For example, we know that among ultra Orthodox, the numbers are exceptionally high. Now, there's an argument in Israeli society. Why is that? Some people say it's because their leadership doesn't really accept the authority of the state of Israel, and therefore they do not they do not comply with the restrictions and with the regulations. That's one argument. The other argument says, well, you have to understand they were basically put in this impossible situation. What are you going to do if you 15 people live in a tiny apartment? What are their options? They don't own a house in the countryside, and so they really don't have much of an option. Their living conditions, their lives, their lives are very, very difficult. And it's very similar to what happened in the United States among low-income families that were more exposed and vulnerable um, to COVID-19. But in any event, it created a major rift within Israeli society. I can tell you, I'm 58 years old. I do not remember such a degree of animosity towards the ultra Orthodox because of COVID 19. So, COVID 19 cracked at least the perception of solidarity among Israelis. And the same clash, the inevitable clash that is happening in the United States and other parts of the world, is also happening in Israel. Although in Israel, it will be with a different level of intensity. What is that clash? The clash is between two forces, one that urges for a new world order and one that is urging for the restoration of the old or the pre-existing world order. The ones who push for the new old world order say very simply, listen, the universe was trying to tell us something. We better take note. We better pay attention. And I anticipate and predict that this will give a major boost to the climate change conversation, to a more collaborative form of international relations, very similar to what happened post World War II, when the world realized after the war, after this unprecedented devastation in mid 20th century, that we need to work together, otherwise we're not going to survive. And then lastly, the new order people will push for flex economy. Flex economies, one of its more visible features is gig economy. There's a wonderful Israeli company, by the way, called Fiverr with double R in the end, that is a perfect example of what gig economy will look like. Flex economy is the economy that allows governments to shift from one sector to another very, very quickly. And so this is what the new order people will probably push for. It's already happening. If you're looking at the presidential campaign, the issues on the table, to the extent that the candidates are discussing the issues. But then you have a very powerful conversation coming from the other side, represented usually by more conservative political forces that says, before COVID-19, we actually had it great. We had a good thing going all over the world. We've never been stronger. The economy's never been stronger. We managed to increase life expectancy all over the world. And let's not forget, again, that the agent of the pandemic was globalization, was global travel. So let's restrict globalization, travel. Let's restrict immigration. Let's restore the old order. Let's go back to the situation before COVID-19. In many cases, this involves denial of the virus and its repercussions and implications. That clash is happening not only in the United States and in Israel, it's happening all over the world, even in countries that are not transparent to us. Believe me, it's happening over there. If you think that the normalization between Israel and the Gulf countries is not related to COVID-19, think again. The young Arab leaders in the Gulf region are looking around with great concern as their oil reserves are depleting, and they know that they have a window of opportunity of maybe 10, 20 years to shift their economies, the foundations of their economies, from an economy based on natural resources to an economy based on knowledge. And when they look around them in the Middle Eastern space, the only possible strategic ally is the state of Israel. And they are drawn to Israel's creative spirit. And Stephen was kind and generous enough to mention the Brand Israel program. What is the Brand Israel program? In one sentence, the whole idea is to say, let's forget about this futile exercise of arguing endlessly about who's right and who's wrong in the conflict between Israelis and Arabs. Let's begin a celebration of Israel's relative advantages and competitive edge, because no place in the world, no brand in the world can succeed by constantly discussing its problems. And that's what Israel did for decades. And thank God for Steve Jobs, because Steve Jobs in 2007 introduced the smartphone and allowed each and every Israeli and each and every Canadian, each and every person that owns a smartphone to design their own informational feed and therefore be able to communicate in an unmediated fashion the values and the assets and the qualities of their own nation. So Israel today is communicated to the world by 9.5 million Israelis that are connected to the world. And those 9.5 million Israelis are communicating an unmediated, authentic, uncensored, very attractive reality in Israel during COVID-19, before COVID-19, and thank God also after COVID-19. We have to understand that this is a very critical point to the understanding the way it works. What are the scenarios? There are several scenarios. I think that there's definitely the possibility of a new Deal on a global scale as a result of COVID-19. I heard from a very optimistic scientist that COVID-19 is the last pandemic because the amount of money put in, and I know that in Israel, there are at least 5 or 6 teams of scientists. You mentioned Tel Aviv University, and I'm a member of the board of governors at Tel Aviv University. Tel Aviv University is involved, Weizmann is involved, Technion is involved, Hebrew U is involved, working with 133 teams of scientists all over the world. And this is something that is happening under the radar of the governments. This is not even reported to the government. The scientists are collaborating because this is the most important thing that humanity can do right now. And so the collaboration is going to be the mode of operation, very similar again to the way the world reacted to the trauma of World War II. The other thing that will happen is that I think more quickly we will move to a cashless world. It's already happening in Israel. In Israel, we have a huge problem with what we call black economy sectors that work in cash, like the ultra-Orthodox and the Arabs. And I think that COVID-19 will help governments implement the kind of compliance that will produce cashless systems, will also increase, obviously, tax revenue and so on. Competition will have a different face, although it will be no less intense than pre-COVID-19 competition. And the competition, again, we see it in Israel, the competition will be over which entity will be able to provide safety. We have to remember COVID-19 changed the way we understand safety, just as the HIV/AIDS crisis changed the way we understand sexual relations, and just as 9/11 changed the way we understand global travel, COVID-19 changed the very definition of what it means to be safe. And my safety is not only dependent upon my own actions. My safety depends upon the actions of my fellow human beings. And that creates a whole new mindset for many people, especially the younger people. It's a new mindset. For someone like me who served in the army and unfortunately had to see combat in Lebanon in 1982, 1983, 1984, I understand the notion of solidarity a bit different. An interesting point about the Israeli political system, as opposed to, let's say, the American political system, where the gravitation is towards the extremes. And when you look at the American political system, and I don't think that's the case in Canada. I'm not an expert on the Canadian system, but in the United States, there's no question in my mind that they lost the viable political center. In Israel, actually, the gravitation is towards the center. Everybody wants to be in the center. The most interesting phenomenon of late in Israel is the rise, at least in public opinion surveys, of Naftali Bennett's right-wing, secular right-wing faction called Yamina. It's interesting because, again, the reason why Naftali Bennett is projected to do very well in the next elections is because he moved to the center. So in Israel, the gravitation is towards the center, unlike other countries, for example, the United States, where the gravitation is towards the extreme. It's a very interesting feature in the Israeli political system. Normalization with the Gulf countries is only the beginning, I believe. I think that next in line, the holy grail of the region, which will be, of course, Saudi Arabia. But even the other day, the daughter of the president of Lebanon said, I don't see why Israel shouldn't have peace with Lebanon. Lebanon is a natural partner for normalization agreements with Israel. All the Maghreb countries, the North African countries, some of which already had some level of diplomatic ties with Israel, like Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria. There is no reason why Israel shouldn't have peace with Libya or even with Yemen, although Yemen is in deep trouble internally, but with Israel, there's no conflict. And so the reason why we actually need that kind of agreement, normalization agreement, is not because we had a military conflict with all those nations. The reason is that in 1945, the Arab League, which is the umbrella organization of 22 Arab nations, today it's 23, decided, just as the information about the scope and the magnitude of the Holocaust started to arrive in Palestine, and this is way before internet or electronic media, it took months for people to actually learn about what happened in the Holocaust. I remember I was asking my parents, and they told me we didn't know much about what happened. We just heard there were lots of rumors. But in 1945, the Yeshuv, the Jews that lived in Palestine, 500,000 people, started to fully understand what happened in Europe. Just as that dawned on them, the Arabs made a decision to eliminate the Jewish community in Palestine by enacting the Arab economic boycott. Now, this was a very big deal because the Arab economic boycott had, and still has, by the way, a supervision mechanism based in Damascus. And their job was to make sure that the entire world is complying with the boycott. And the boycott basically prevented countries from purchasing products that were made by the tiny economy of 500,000 Jews. And by the way, zero export at the time, 1945. Believe it or not, even the world's most famous brands that did not explicitly comply with the boycott implicitly did. And that was the biggest problem Israel was facing. We didn't have most of the Western brands. The only country that did business with us was France until 1967. That's why in Israel we had such a dominance of French culture. The dream of every young Israeli was to go to Paris to get a degree, not to go to New York, not to go to Toronto or Montreal. It was to go to Paris. Paris was the focal point for the young Israelis. And of course, the brands that we consumed were largely French brands. The most Western brands and certainly American brands shied away from Israel. For example, the exceptions were Coca-Cola and TWA, but most American brands shied away. Pepsi, for many, many years, didn't do any business in Israel. The Marriott didn't do business in Israel, and so on and so forth. And I mentioned that because Israel's reaction to the Arab economic boycott is what shaped the foundations of the so-called startup nation. How come? Israel's response was to, again, develop an economy based on knowledge, to develop markets elsewhere outside of the Middle East, most notably in Europe, which is Israel's largest trade partner until this very day, in Asia and in North America. And of course, and lastly, to invest a great deal in you, in diaspora Jews. And the creation of the State of Israel bonds in 1951 was a direct response to the Arab economic boycott and the idea of turning to world Jewry, in your case, Canadian Jewry, and ask them to invest in Israel's future as a vote of confidence was a very bold move that proved itself, because in 1951, Israel didn't have much to sell. The most important thing is that normalization with the Gulf countries signals the ultimate victory of Zionism. Let me explain. Between 1850 to 1924, about 2.2 million Jews left Eastern Europe and moved to North America, mostly to the United States, but also, you know that very well, to Canada. The Baron Hirsch, for example, who was the biggest Jewish philanthropist of his time, settled Jews in parts of Canada like Nova Scotia, Alaska, Saskatchewan, also in the United States, in New Jersey, even in Argentina, but he did not settle Jews in Palestine. During that time, and that ended, of course, as you all know, with the Johnson-Reed Act, which is amazing, exactly 100 years ago. It looks like in the United States is in a 100-year cycle. It was the same anti-immigration sentiment that you see today. And the Johnson-Reed Act basically put an end to immigration of Chinese and Italians and Irish and Jews from Eastern Europe to the United States, and unknowingly, of course, doomed millions of Jews in Europe to death because they couldn't leave Europe when Nazism took over. But during that time, that's very important to understand. During that time, when 2.2 million Jews moved from Eastern Europe to North America for a better world, how many people are buying into the Zionist idea? How many people settle in Palestine? Like my family that came in 1874 from Uzbekistan, and my mother's family that came from Yemen in 1912. How many people? Between 70 to 80,000 people. And in the 1930s, we have negative migration, meaning more people are leaving Palestine than coming to Palestine. Now, you have to understand, Zionism was not a big hit. What we take today for granted, that we have almost 7 million Jews in Israel, that Israel became the world's largest Jewish community. Zionism has never been stronger in Canada or in the United States or in England. We have to understand that. And the fact that even the Arab economic boycott is fading away slowly is the ultimate triumph of the Zionist idea, which is all about Jewish self-determination. And so Zionism has never been stronger. Israel has never been stronger. Israel's defense doctrine, that you can see the three legs of our defense doctrine on the screen, has never been more effective. And if you look at where the people that tried to eliminate Israel, the countries that tried to eliminate Israel in 1945, in 1948, look at where they are today, right? Look at this slide, and this is the whole story right there. You know, in 1973, Israel's GDP per capita was 50% of the GDP per capita of all of our immediate neighbors combined. Today, it's 3 times the size of the GDP of all of our neighbors combined. And then the most important thing, unprecedented level of intimacy with the world's greatest powers, China, India, Brazil, and so on. And not to mention unprecedented level of intimacy with Egypt, with Saudi Arabia, with the Gulf countries. And I believe that, again, we'll hear from Saudi Arabia very, very soon. Last thing that I will say before we open this, I know that, and Steve, let me know if I have some more time, or when do we have to go to the Q&A. But last thing that I would say, that, yes, Steve, do we have more time?
So another, say, couple of minutes, so we can then move to the Q&A. Yeah.
All right, terrific. Thank you so much. I'll say one last thing. And again, I'm not saying anything that is political, certainly not to a Canadian audience before the US elections. But Donald Trump is a disruptor. Is a disruptor in politics, but also in foreign policy. He came to the Middle East with a different approach. And it seems that his approach is actually working. and again, I'm not saying anything political here, I'm speaking as a diplomat. What uh, what did he disrupt exactly? The notion of even-handedness, which was a pillar of American foreign policy in the Middle East. Um, the appearance, at least, of being an honest broker, neutrality in foreign policy is very, very important, and so on. But Trump introduced a different approach that says you break it, you pay for it. If the Palestinians reject all the proposals to cut a territorial deal, he said, there's no reason for me to aspire even-handedness. He rejected the a priori demand to be even-handed. And I think that really pushed the rest of the Arab world to that realization that very much the Palestinian issue is off the table because of their own doings, because of the fact that they rejected 3 opportunities in the last 20 years to cut a territorial deal. They rejected the Bill Clinton plan in the summer of 2000. They rejected the Israeli unilateral pullout from Gaza by Ariel Sharon in August of 2005. They rejected Ehud Olmert's plan in 2008, which would have given them 100% of the territory. So this is what happened. I think it's a big change. Even if there's a new administration in the Middle East, I don't see how this new administration is going to backtrack on that, on all those achievements made by the Trump administration. And he certainly deserves credit. We should remember, and that's the last statement I'm making, Israeli government was interested in annexation of the Jordan Valley. With certainly was not an agenda that the Israelis proactively pushed. It was the U.S. administration that introduced normalization to the sideway, the whole idea of annexation.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Great, Ido. Ido, if you could stop sharing your screen now so we can get a better view of you as opposed to the visual.
Yes.
Terrific. And if we can enable the chat as well, so we can start to get some questions from people out in the audience. But to lead off, Ido, in terms of the political system, you talked about the greater rupture, if you will, that's been created between parts of society and the ultra-Orthodox in Israel, which is an important and growing part of the population resulting from this crisis. What do you see as the likely result in the long term? Will things go back to normal, or do you have a prescription for ways that, in fact, we can come out of this with greater unity as an Israeli society?
Yeah, so excellent question. Unity is redefined by technology today. Again, I mentioned those devices. They created what we call digital tribalism. The algorithm is pushing us to the places, to the conversations where we are surrounded by like-minded people. And so that's why pollsters, by the way, completely misread the public opinion sentiment when they look at the elections in the United States, for example. So what will happen in Israel is that this virus is going to change the political landscape. It seems like there is a very solid, united front against the ultra-Orthodox political establishment. So even the rise of Naftali Bennett in public opinion surveys reflects that Naftali Bennett runs on the ticket of, let me manage this crisis. I am the great crisis manager. That's his ticket. And the ultra-Orthodox, at least their aging leadership, is being viewed not only as anti-Zionist or anti-social solidarity, but also as extremely inept. The rabbis are 98 years old, 102 years old, and they are the ones who are dictating what will happen. And again, it's something that the Israeli society, including the national religious people like Naftali Bennett, is not something that we're willing to tolerate. So in that sense, I think the virus is reshaping the political boundaries in Israel, and we will probably see the ultra-Orthodox as not part of the next coalition. If I'm may share with you one of my predictions.
Mhm. Okay, so good jump off to some questions that we have from people in the audience. A question relating to one of your comments was the Gulf states moving closer to Israel, and certainly that, as you, in your view, is partially a function. It's not divorced from what's been happening over the last number of months with coronavirus in the world. You didn't mention Iran, so I'm sure a number of members of the audience have questions about Iran. With the Gulf states moving now closer to Israel and other Arab states, what does that mean for Iran and the long-term threat that it poses to Israel?
So Iran, the way it is being depicted in the West, doesn't see itself, its own self-perception is not of a superpower. There are 1.3 billion Muslims in the world. Only 15% of them are Shiites. The vast majority of the Shiites live in Iran. Iran sees itself within the Muslim world as a minority country, as a fragile, as a country that is pretty related. Many reasons. It's really the defining issue of the region. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's the conflict between Sunnis and Shiites. And so if you understand their aspiration to acquire nuclear military capabilities, an aspiration that started during the days of the Shah, the US administration. Israel is not their main issue. Say that the United States and the Western world, their main issue is regional hegemony. So obviously, Iran is only helping situation, quote unquote, by making the dividing lines very, very clear. I would say it's never been clearer, perhaps not since the first Gulf War of January of 1991 and the invasion of Saddam Hussein to Kuwait in August 2nd of 1990. It's never been clearer on which side you are. Iran is helping us to understand the new divisions in the Middle East. And again, the Palestinians yet again made a huge strategic mistake at the caliber of the mistake they made when they decided to support Saddam Hussein. On this issue, again, they support the Iranians rather than the other camp led by Saudi Arabia. Big mistake, especially in light of the fact that they are the recipients of very generous financial aid from the Gulf countries.
Now, speaking of other countries in the region, one of our questions relates to countries that have had a longer peace with Israel, and that's Egypt and Jordan. And our questioner referred to the peace as a cold peace. Do you see that cold peace getting warmer with the advent of the Abraham Accords?
The answer is no. And the reason is because with Egypt, we had a long and bloody history of confrontations. This was not the case with the Gulf countries. That's why normalization and peace in the Middle East are not the same. Peace is necessary to end the state of war. Normalization is something that is all-encompassing, obviously, conveniently and easily with countries that you never had to fight. Mm-hmm. And that's the case with the Gulf countries. In Jordan, there's a very strong Palestinian element. About 70% of the Jordanians are actually Palestinians. And so the anti-Israel sentiment, especially when you're looking at labor and the trade unions, is prevailing. In Egypt, there's a very strong presence of what we call the Islamic Brothers. And the Islamic Brothers is the ideological generator of Hamas and Islamic Jihad and other radical Islamic groups. And so obviously that's not going to happen in Egypt. I anticipate, by the way, a very strong pushback in Saudi Arabia if and when normalization with Israel will be announced. Again, there's a very strong Islamic element in Saudi Arabian society. It's not happening so much in UAE and Bahrain because they're more Western oriented. But again, I think there's a big difference between the enthusiasm of the leadership and the people in those places. They're very critical of those agreements.
So there's a number of questions related to the neighborhood, and somebody asked about Lebanon, and you referred to the possibility of Lebanon. It would be natural in terms of Lebanon's interests and Israel's interests, although there's tremendous internal strife and dysfunction within Lebanon. Somebody else asked about Turkey. You talked about Iran. What threat does Turkey pose to Israel right now? You had Erdogan just probably a couple of weeks ago almost reclaiming Jerusalem as Turkey. So what do you see there?
So the late Bernard Lewis used to say jokingly that the good news in the Middle East is that Iran wants to be like Turkey. The bad news is that Turkey wants to be like Iran, and I think that's what we're seeing. Turkey under Erdogan foreign strategy after it became clear to them about 10 years ago that they're not going to be accepted into the European Union. So they completely changed their orientation from Western European orientation to Middle Eastern orientation. And Israel was definitely the price that they happily were willing to pay. But the truth is that in the last 15 years, trade between Israel and Turkey actually tripled. Tourism from Israel to Turkey has been going strong before COVID-19, especially Arab Israelis. So life has its own inertia. Erdogan is on a declarative level, is a serious foe of Israel and the Western world. But in practice, they know Turkey has a sizable economy. It's an economy that suffers from many systemic deficiencies, and they're dependent at the end of the day upon their ability to interact smoothly with the global financial system. And even Erdogan knows that. So words are cheap, and he certainly makes that. But I'm really not worried about what will happen with Turkey. Again, as long as the U.S. economy remains robust, we don't really have to worry about that. You mentioned Lebanon. It's important for our audience to know that Israel, and I say this as someone who spent years discussing this issue as a diplomat, Israel never had any dispute with Lebanon, the fact that the Lebanese themselves could not control Hezbollah. So Lebanon, we are suffering because of a Lebanese internal problem. But we don't have any territorial claims. When it comes to Lebanon, we don't have any dispute over water rights like we had with Jordan or with Syria. The only dispute that right now is on the table has something to do with the demarcation of the marine border, and it has a lot to do with the deposits of natural gas and oil discovered in the Mediterranean, and it's certainly something that is fixable. I don't see it as a major issue, but we really, there's no reason in the world why Israel and Lebanon will not have normalized relations.
So we're speaking about countries. You mentioned for a moment without regard to what you would support in the US political system, the changes under the current President Trump, and that you didn't think those changes would be rolled back or couldn't be rolled back under a new administration. Can you expand a little bit on that, given that we have a US election next week? Most of the polls, you never know what's going to happen, but most of the polls are suggesting that it will be a Biden-Harris administration. If that were to come to true, what implications do you see for Israel, sort of top 2 or 3 implications?
I think that it will, both of them, Biden and Harris, are committed to Israel. Especially Biden has a long history of working together with AIPAC. He is intimately familiar with Israeli leadership. He is a veteran of Washington, D.C. political apparatus, and therefore, I think he has more mileage than any other candidate in recent history when it comes to Israel. He's been to Israel many, many times, and he has many friends in Israel. So I don't think that Biden will change anything, especially when the so-called Trump doctrine, and again, I'm not making any political statement, did not work. But the Trump doctrine works. It's working because don't even think about moving the embassy to Jerusalem because it would, erupt the entire region, and he did. Nothing happened really, and so I don't think it's going to. United States foreign policy under Biden will be something that the Israelis will signal something in terms of the fate of Netanyahu himself, because Netanyahu tied his political destiny with Trump.
Right. So
he hurt Netanyahu politically in Israel.
So in terms of the political system itself, and you talked about a movement to the center, that even though, people from afar might see, oh, there's the ultra Orthodox parties, or there's parties here on the left, et cetera, and parties moving further apart, ultimately coming together. And of course, we saw Blue and White, which wasn't an ideological party particularly, was a party in opposition to the party that's been in power for a very long time. What do you see permanent changes to the Israeli political system itself, such as a smaller number of parties actually gaining support, or do you see the opposite happening out of this crisis?
I think the opposite will happen. I think that we will see more and more factions, small political parties. The Israeli system is fundamentally different than the American system, in the sense that in Israel, it's the cabinet that is the commander-in-chief and the diplomat-in-chief, not the prime minister. The prime minister is first among equals. That's why the prime minister doesn't enjoy legal immunity in Israel. And so, unlike the United States. And so the task of governing is becoming increasingly more and more difficult, because any prime minister in Israel would have to spend a significant portion of their energy just on the maintenance of the coalition. And so if the average number of political parties in the Israeli parliament is between 10 to 13 in the last 20 years, I don't see that changing, perhaps even increasing. But the big seismic shift is going to be the alliance between the Jewish parties and the Arab parties. The Israeli left is pushed to form a political alliance with the Arab parties. Something happened last year when the Arab parties, and including a radical Islamic faction within it, recommended Benny Gantz to be the prime minister, which is an historical shift. It's never happened before. And so I think that this is the big bang of Israeli political system, the formation of a Jewish Arab political platform and partnership.
So that's a fascinating insight, and certainly something historically we really haven't seen in the history of the state of Israel, and something we'll be watching out for. There are quite a number of other questions which I think reflects the interest that people had in what you have to say and your insights. It's great to have seen you from Jerusalem tonight. It's wonderful that you're in Jerusalem joining us, even though it's now closing in on the middle of the night. So I'd like to now turn it over to Erwin Michael.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Erwin Michael, and we've been very fortunate to have had Ambassador Aharoni speak to our group tonight. My main comments are, wow, what a powerful, informative, and stimulating talk. I'm still trying to process the first 10 minutes of your presentation. In all candor, Ambassador, when I was asked to provide closing remarks on your presentation, I was not familiar with your background. And in doing my research, I was pleasantly overwhelmed. And what I discovered was an incredible multi-dimensional person. Highlighting some facts, we all know you were in the IDF. You retired at 48 as a major. You served under Shimon Peres as a policy assistant with regard to the Oslo Accord negotiations. And you attended the signing ceremony in the White House in September 1993. The multiple awards you have won from many of your accomplishments, from Israel Bonds, the Albert Einstein Foundation, the Hadassah Women's Organization. And I noticed that in 2013, you were named among the top 100 people positively affecting Jewish life. I recognize you're a well sought after public speaker and on numerous topics, and you obviously opened up a number of others here on politics, foreign relations, mass media, public marketing, and nation branding. You've lectured at many universities, including my own alma mater, the University of Pennsylvania. And incidentally, I stopped counting after 25. However, the most interesting fact that I came across was that you graduated from Tel Aviv University, magna cum laude, with a BA in film and television, not diplomacy, which explains the very impressive Zoom interview that you hosted 3 weeks ago with actor Robert De Niro. I sat through the whole 33 minutes and enjoyed it immensely. By the way, I found Robert De Niro a lot nicer in person than his character Jack Burns in Meet the Fockers. Summing up, on behalf of the Adath Israel Congregation, I would like to thank you, Ambassador, for a terrific talk in the Israeli political system. And given your extensive background, knowledge, and experience on innumerable other topics, we hope to host you again in the future. Now, normally we offer a small token of our appreciation to our speakers. However, given COVID-19, the best I can offer you is an elbow shake. Before closing, I would like to thank again the Adult Education Committee of Adath Israel, Dr. Joe Traeger, and Phil David, Executive Director, for putting together today's program. Finally, I want to thank everyone for attending this evening's presentation. Stay safe and good night.